Since day one of this Back to Sunday School series, I've been pestering Brian about why he hasn't referenced a very important piece of pop culture. A piece of pop culture that shaped the faith and biblical knowledge of thousands of children growing up in the 90s and early 2000s. He says it's because he isn't part of that generation. Well, guess what? I am, and I will not let the opportunity to reference the masterpiece that is VeggieTales pass me by. That's right, the animated series that features talking vegetables and occasionally fruit, acting out Bible stories and singing silly little songs along the way. VeggieTales was pivotal to my biblical education as a child, and I can still sing most of the songs by memory. If you're not a millennial or didn't raise a millennial, I recommend you look up the episode about Daniel and the Lion's Den on YouTube after this sermon. But be warned, the songs are ridiculously catchy. In all seriousness, Daniel and the Lion's Den is one of those Bible stories that I really only heard as a child. I can't remember the last time I heard a sermon on it as an adult, and I expect that's true for many of you as well. They're stories that we know in theory because we heard them as children, but we've never really revisited them as adults. So let's start with the basics. Our story begins with Israelites living in Jerusalem under Babylonian rule. Daniel, an Israelite, is chosen to move to the palace as a youth to receive an education in the language and literature of the Babylonians. He, along with several other young Israelite boys, was given a new Babylonian name and was trained up to one day serve the king. Daniel is intelligent, a quick learner, and is well liked by everyone in the palace, especially the king. He makes his way up the ranks and becomes an administrator over one of the many territories in the kingdom. He was so good at his job that King Darius was determined to promote him to administrator over the entire kingdom. The other administrators were not happy about this. Daniel is Jewish, an outsider, one of the people their kingdom conquered. He shouldn't be given so much power. He wasn't worthy of it. He needed to be put in his place. So they concocted a plan to get rid of him, which was more difficult than they initially planned because Daniel was a good man who followed the law. They knew their only option was to entrap him on the basis of his faith in the Jewish God. So they went to King Darius and convinced him to sign a royal edict that anyone who prays to any god or human besides him during the next 30 days should be thrown into the lion's den. Daniel learned about the decree, but he still went to his upstairs room, opened the windows, and prayed to his God like he did every day. The administrators had him arrested and brought before the king. Darius was distraught and spent an entire day trying to find a way to pardon Daniel. But his advisors reminded him that he could not revoke the edict. King Darius then approved Daniel being thrown into the den, telling him that he hoped his God would save him. After a night of no sleep and no food, King Darius ran to the lion's den first thing the next morning. He called out to Daniel to see if he was still alive. And by a miracle of God, Daniel responded that he was unharmed. King Darius released him, punished the advisors who had entrapped Daniel by throwing them and their families into the lion's den, and then issued a new decree that everyone in the land was free to worship the God of Daniel. The most straightforward interpretation of this story is the one we often hear in the versions we tell to children. Have faith in God, and God will protect you in difficult circumstances. Or when your faith is tested, be ready to stand strong in that faith, even risking death, as an example to non-believers so that they will be in awe and convert to Christianity. You can definitely make a case for both of those interpretations, but neither fully captures the depth and the richness of what the writer of Daniel is trying to convey. The book of Daniel is part of the genre of resistance literature in the Bible. Resistance literature in the Bible pushes back against the oppressive powers of the day, calling out injustice and abuses of power. It emphasizes themes of resistance and liberation as a source of hope for oppressed peoples. In this case, the audience was Jewish exiles living under Babylonian rule. These exiles were treated as second-class citizens. They watched as the Babylonians defiled the temple in Jerusalem, their holiest of places, by offering sacrifices to Babylonian gods instead. Important cultural and religious practices like Sabbath and circumcision were banned. They were removed from their homes and forced to resettle in far-flung corners of the empire. They faced bigotry and resentment from Babylonians for being outsiders. The story of Daniel gave them hope that God was still with them and would deliver them, that their exile wouldn't last forever. Daniel's legacy as resistance literature has carried through the centuries, providing hope and inspiration for everyone from the early Christian church to Mahatma Gandhi. Yes, that Gandhi. Gandhi first discovered the book of Daniel during his time in a South African prison. One of the few books available for him to read was the Bible. He immediately connected with the story of Daniel and the lion's den. Daniel was an example of the kind of nonviolent resistance in the face of empire that Gandhi practiced and taught. Daniel was steadfast in his convictions and publicly defied the government's unjust laws, even risking death. Gandhi referenced Daniel again and again in his writings and speeches, declaring him a satyagrahi. A satyagrahi is someone who practices intentional nonviolent resistance, who holds steadfastly to truth and lives in accordance with truth, who takes action with their bodies, and who doesn't harbor anger or hatred towards their oppressors. I find it fascinating and powerful that Gandhi, who is neither Christian or Jewish, took inspiration from the book of Daniel for the incredible work that he did throughout his life. This is why it's so important that we read the Bible with open hearts and minds. The stories of Scripture still speak to us today, even if what they have to say is difficult and messy and sometimes confusing. When we oversimplify or sanitize them, we risk missing their deeply powerful lessons and the hope that they speak into our current moment. Daniel is just one of many books in the Bible that remind us that following God is not simply an individual spiritual exercise. Following God is a collective movement that asks us to take action and seek the flourishing of all people. Sometimes that involves speaking out against the powers that be when they are harming our neighbors through violence, unjust laws, and abuses of power. And through the story of Daniel in the lion's den, we see that God honors our resistance. God is always for liberation. Not only is Daniel a model for how to resist, he's a model of hope. Hope that resistance can create change, that standing firm in our convictions is not a futile exercise. King Darius is so moved by who Daniel is and what he stands for that he changes his mind. He rescinds the edict and allows people to worship the Jewish God without fear of punishment. For Israelites living in exile, this was a powerful encouragement for them to keep going, to keep believing that things would change one day, that their sacrifices and resistance were not in vain and that God was still with them. Throughout history, when people come together to stand up for what is right, change has happened. Not always in the big, immediate, miraculous way that appears to happen in Daniel 6. Change happens through thousands and thousands of small acts of resistance by everyday people that build to a pivotal moment. Daniel's resistance didn't happen in a vacuum. He was shaped and influenced by all the people who came before him, whether he realized it or not. The same is true for Gandhi, one of Daniel's biggest fans. India and Pakistan didn't finally gain independence from the British Empire because of one big act by one man. Gandhi was a key player, of course, but he was part of a larger community of ordinary people resisting British rule in their day-to-day lives. The civil rights movement here in America in the 60s had been building for hundreds of years, starting with the original Africans enslaved in the colonies. Rights for women and LGBTQ+ people weren't won overnight, but day by day, through persistence in small and large acts of resistance, through the growing numbers of people willing to say no to injustice, hatred, and violence, people willing to say that's not right, and we demand better from our government, our institutions, and each other. There will always be injustices and wrongs that need to be made right. They may look different for every generation and every context, but there will never be a shortage of opportunities for us to stand up for what's right. I can name about 10 things off the top of my head right now that need changing, and I bet you can too. The question is, will we be like Daniel? Will we take action and raise our voices even if there are consequences? Or will we sit by and just let it happen? Daniel resisted the king's edict, knowing that the consequence was death. But for most of us, especially if we come from a place of privilege, that's not necessarily the consequence we'd be risking with our resistance. We're risking our reputations, some of our relationships, maybe even our jobs. I don't want to minimize that reality. If you speak up against injustice, it could cause a rift in relationships with your family members and friends who disagree with you. If you speak up against injustice in the workplace, you risk your employment or your professional reputation with people who disagree with you. So we each have to decide for ourselves what risks are worth taking and how to prepare for things to go sideways. On the other hand, those worst-case scenarios don't always happen. By speaking out or taking